The World Bank has been in existence here in Malawi for many years, with a lot of lives touched and changed through World Bank projects here in Malawi. It is therefore a viable and truthful need to see exactly what the World Bank has been doing and what it will do to the Malawian community in order to continue to improve the livelihoods of people here in Malawi. To do so, I have the World Bank country manager, Mr. Hugh Riddell, who will be able to explain to us exactly how the World Bank has been doing and the future of World Bank and Malawi partnerships here in Malawi in order to continue to change the livelihoods of people here in Malawi. My name is Ghwabupi Mwabungulu and this is Unpacked on NBC. Welcome to the program, Mr. Riddell.
Thank you.
Now, since we have seen the multiple crises that happened here in Malawi, and then you came in the time of COVID, what are the most highlighted challenges that were faced in your career at the World Bank here in Malawi, like really the most challenges?
Well, I think COVID was something experienced by the world, but since then we've had three really historic cyclones, Anna, Gombe, Freddy. These cyclones came unexpectedly. Anna took out 1/3 of the power supply with the Capachura Dam. Any country that's facing the loss of 1/3 of its power capacity is going to have massive economic challenges. Cholera outbreak, the worst in a generation, Malawi faced in the wake of those cyclones. And then Cyclone Freddy itself, which was a new kind of phenomenon for Malawi. We saw a lot more landslides, we saw a lot more impacts in urban areas, massive displacement. And the sheer frequency of these crises is really unheard of. I think it tells us a lot about what the country needs to prepare for the future, and how next time we need to be better prepared even as we go into these crises.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of better preparations, like what you've just said, now how do you see the role of the World Bank evolving in the years coming, especially in the context of sub-Saharan Africa as well as here in Malawi? How do you see the role of the World Bank there?
I think the World Bank plays an important part, but much more important, of course, is the economic policies of those countries. If the world is going to face more of these shocks, then countries need to be better prepared. And what do I mean by better prepared? We saw in 2020, even as COVID was starting, fiscal and economic buffers were very, very weak in Malawi. So Malawi came into this 4 years of crisis unprepared. What we're talking about is structural imbalances. And if I think about the country today, as I leave, what worries me most, what gives me most pause for concern, is that the country still faces massive fiscal imbalance and balance of payments imbalance. These two structural imbalances leave the country exposed for the next round of crises. The country simply is spending more than it can afford to spend, both in terms of its budget and in terms of its imports versus exports. So we need to see a structural adjustment, a structural transformation of the economy, so that the country is then on a sounder footing. The World Bank has done a lot in the last 4 years in partnership with the government to respond, but that's not a sustainable approach. Our money cannot substitute for sound economic foundations so that the country can survive on its own, self-reliant, in the words of Vision 2063. So we must do better as the World Bank, as our government partners, in ensuring that these economic reforms are now implemented, concrete measures to put the country on a sound path for growth.
If you take it on a personal level, what do you think we should do as Malawians so that we should be self-reliant? When we look at our policies and we look at the downside of the buffers, what do you think we should do as Malawi exactly, as a personal opinion?
I think there's a few big changes that all Malawians can participate in and encourage. And I must say, in Malawi, one of the best things, one of the most hopeful aspects of this country is the voice that Malawians have, and the fact that people are empowered. There's access to information. People can demonstrate openly. There's free speech. there's elections. This is not something to be taken for granted. So that puts the country already at an advantage. Let me touch on a couple of the things that I think would be incredibly powerful for the country's future. Number one is shifting away from this reliance on rain-fed agriculture. When people talk about climate-smart agriculture, what we really mean is irrigation and water storage. The country has water, but it's not using it. This would mean that what we see at the moment, these very slight variations in rainfall pattern, or late rains or early rains, or too much or too little, these things that are not historic cyclones can quickly escalate into a major crisis in terms of food security. And that doesn't need to be the case. It's because Malawi is very dependent on rain-fed agriculture. So shifting that model away. Second is the energy sector and energy security, energy resilience. I think that what we saw with Kapachira gave an important lesson. This over-reliance on just one or two of these hydros on the Shire is dangerous for the country. What this needs is a much greater investment in generation, and that's what ImpatManga offers. As a storage facility, as a peaking power plant, meaning you can actually sell energy to the Southern African power pool, earn US dollars like that, but also the interconnector with Mozambique. That's going to provide much greater stability to the sector, to the system, to the grid system, and that redundancy as well. So that's the second. The third is really about environmental management, and this is something that all Malawians can do in their communities. We need to see a shift away from the dependence on biomass for energy at the community and household level. That's tough. People need to cook, people need to eat, but we need rapidly to provide those alternatives to stop the cutting that is absolutely bringing the productivity of the soil to crisis levels. And finally, the fourth would be this macroeconomic adjustment, whereby the country has the fiscal buffers and the dollars in the reserves that can protect the country when the crises hit, so that we don't go into a spiral of macroeconomic crisis.
Now, taking you back to the mentioning of ImpatManga, should we expect something from the World Bank on that angle? Because we have seen how the cyclones hit us, and we had no power for maybe weeks and months, and we just started to regain ourselves. That means we lost a lot economically. Now, should we expect something from that angle, that the World Bank is going to chip in and help, so that at least the growth of the economy in Malawi can be seen, and then we can be able to maybe export the electricity? Can we see the World Bank doing something on that?
Absolutely. The World Bank and the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, are both working hard on ImpatManga. And I must say, it's an area that I'm very hopeful about, because Malawi has managed to attract some world-class sponsors in the private sector. I think ImpatManga is a game changer for the country, not only because of the energy that will be produced to support the mining sector to develop, but also because of the demonstration effect. These private sector sponsors from overseas are coming to Malawi. They're going to invest. That's going to create jobs, but it's also going to send a message to other private investors that Malawi is open for business. The other thing that ImpatManga will do is, because it doubles the capacity in the country, it creates a stable base load which can leverage other solar IPPs. So there's a couple of small 60 megawatt solar IPPs currently, but that can rapidly scale up with much more investment from the private sector once you have a stable base load in the grid, and that's what ImpatManga can provide. So I'm very hopeful. The World Bank is supporting. This is moving now very fast. It's not a new idea. It's been running for some time, but we're very close to the finishing line, and I'm very excited about that investment.
Now, speaking of collaborations and partnerships, can you reflect on the importance of collaboration and partnerships in achieving the World Bank's goals?
Partnerships are really important, because what we don't want to see in Malawi is small pilot projects everywhere. Right? This is not achieving impact at scale. And Malawi is a country that badly needs scale impact. You mentioned at the beginning the household level, the community level. Poverty levels are still at 70%, just like they were 20 years ago. So we have not seen the kind of growth that can lift people out of poverty. And that's unlike the rest of the region where we are seeing poverty reduction. So we urgently need in Malawi investments at scale. And that's what partnerships can provide. And I'm really proud that in the last 4 years, we've started to see those partnerships now emerge in the international community, coming together both around AgCom, the government's flagship commercialization program, which we support with IDA investment, scaling up very rapidly, and now bringing in investment from a number of our development partners. And then also with social protection. So we've seen a tremendous solidarity effort amongst the international partners coming together to create a scalable safety net that's able to respond to the shocks that we've seen. In fact, coverage of the social protection safety net has gone from, has increased, I think, from about 7% to 20% over the last 4 years. And that's in response to these kinds of crises. And we couldn't have done that without the partnerships and the solidarity that the international community has felt. The other important thing about these partnerships is it's bringing donor money back onto the budget through trusted mechanisms that have oversight on the fiduciary audits, etc. I think using country systems is a better way forward for countries like Malawi, which are very aid dependent. It can bring harmonization, the scale that I was talking about, but also strengthens the capacity of the institutions. Donors are not here forever. And we need the institutions, the Malawian institutions, to stand proudly on their own feet for the future.
Now, speaking on the issue of people need to stand on their own, when we take a look at the issue of like the social cash transfers and other amenities that go into the communities, what other mechanisms do you think should be employed in order for the people to continue with the projects or with the livelihoods when the projects phase out or when the money is no longer there? Because sometimes we have to wait for donor funds maybe for years before they come in to help other people. What skills do you think are formidable for the people to continue with their life?
Yeah, I think this is, you've raised a really important point, and everything that we do needs to be about giving people a hand up and not a hand out. The World Bank, maybe the core principle of the World Bank is that economies need to become sustainable, and that starts at the community level, at the household level. Teach a man to fish. So I'm proud of the work we're doing on AgCom, which creates access to finance for farmer groups only if those farmer groups are putting their own money on the table, and only if those farmer groups have already found an off-taker for the produce that they plan to create. Then we come in. So we're actually backing groups of individuals who've come together under their own steam, with their own ideas, with their own innovation. So that's number one, and that's why that program is attracting so much attention and scaling up to really hundreds of thousands of people. The second is that social protection tends to get this criticism that it's unsustainable, that it's a handout, and I think that's absolutely wrong. What I see when I visit the communities is people coming together to help themselves and to protect those communities from the next shock, the next crisis, by creating sustainable livelihoods and that climate resilience that's so important. So we've scaled up our financing of the government's climate smart public works program. And it's really inspiring to go there because communities come together, they set their own bylaws about how to manage the forestry around those communities better. We put in some financing, but they also save the financing that they earn through the village savings and loan schemes. And you see women coming together and creating viable livelihoods for the future, which means that next time around we won't be necessary, our money is not necessary. There's always a role for scaling up some cash at times of crisis. This happens globally, and it's a critical part of recovery after the crisis. But we must focus on teaching people to fish and not giving them the fish.
Now, looking at the time of you as the country manager at the World Bank, what are the most proud moments that we have accomplished in this office?
One of the things I'm proud of is that we had to respond flexibly to all of these shocks. It was painful for us in the sense that we had to take money out of programs move money around in the portfolio very rapidly, and that we managed to get a response to every single crisis that took place, and we, I think, protected people's livelihoods and ensured a better economic recovery. But at the same time, we didn't lose sight of the very important structural reforms that are needed to put the country back on a growth path. Because it would have been a disaster if we just simply put a lot of money on the table to protect the poorest. This would have been like a handout, right? But it was a two-track approach. We did the response, but we also kept true to the fundamental objective which we all share, which is the economic transformation of the country, sustainable growth. So, budget support. During the last 4 years, we worked very hard with the government on the economic reform agenda, together with the IMF. At the end of 2023, finally the country got back onto an ECF agreement with the fund, which opened the way for budget support. I think the last time we were doing budget support was 2017. Today, still, we're in dialogue on the second phase of that budget support. So it's incredibly important that the government follows through on the ECF, which is a 5-year framework, and implements the reforms meticulously and stays on track, demonstrates to the international community that Malawi can do what it takes to stay on track on a very difficult program. And that will enable us in the World Bank to continue to support the structural reforms in the energy sector, in the agriculture sector, in public finance management, and so on. So that's been a big achievement, that we've managed to do both the speedy response, the flexible response, as well as the medium-term focus on structural reforms.
Now, in the spirit of speedy and functionality as well, on the bigger picture, that's a budget support. Now, if we look at the common Malawian, we have seen, maybe when you work in the communities, you have seen that we have to start on the basic structure, the basic economic pyramid. Like, you have to go in the household and to the communities in order to support them economically. Now, there are some challenges, or there are some times whereby not everybody receives the help that they need. What's your take as World Bank?
You know, these kinds of things, I think the best answer is that a project here or a project there or expanding this activity, this is not the answer. These people you talk about, they have the answers themselves. They don't need us, they don't need a project. What they need most, in my view, is macroeconomic stability. Because what is impacting their life most, probably right now, is inflation. The daily cost of living, it's going up. We're at 33%, it was a little bit higher last quarter. Inflation is a massive burden on the poor. What is driving inflation are these fiscal imbalances that I talked about. If you look at the African continent, Malawi has run the largest fiscal deficit for the last 2 years of all African countries. And that is what's driving both the rising domestic debt. Domestic debt is now the largest part of the budget. It's also putting pressure on inflation. So it's crowding out the private sector and it's hurting the poor. That is why when the IMF or the World Bank are talking about macroeconomic stability, what we're really talking about is those people. It's not a theoretical argument. It has an impact right now on the poorest. So if we can fix these macroeconomic imbalances now, which is in the power of the authorities, then I think we're going to have the biggest possible impact, much bigger than if the World Bank expands the safety net or grows AgCom more. We'll do these things, and we'll do them more with macroeconomic stability. So this is why it's so important and so urgent, because Malawi cannot afford to continue on this path.
Malawi, yes, cannot continue to look into that path. We need to move forward as a country. There's just so much that needs to be done in order to improve the livelihoods of the people. Now, how optimistic are you on Malawi's debt restructuring process? Now, is it promising, and perhaps the overall economic growth?
Malawi is not alone, and that's because of this polycrisis phenomenon that many countries have felt. But it's a big wake-up call, and we need to do more as the bank. And as I said at the beginning, these countries need to step up as well on their side and be better prepared for the shocks and put the economic structure in order as a first priority. The debt restructuring was a critical element of the IMF ECF, and we understand that good faith negotiations are ongoing with the key creditors to the country on the external side. To an extent, some of these discussions are not in the control of the authorities because it takes two to come to an agreement. But it's very important that these discussions continue in good faith and we reach a speedy resolution. But we've seen from other countries that these discussions can be time intensive. I'm extremely hopeful because the authorities are clearly very committed to restructure their debt on the external side. What I would say is that as we do that, we also need to keep an eye on domestic debt. As I mentioned earlier, domestic debt is now the single biggest part of the government's budget. And every year it's getting bigger because of the fiscal deficits that are being run and because of the arrears that are accumulated, because of the state-owned enterprises that suddenly need to be bailed out. So all of these things are impacting the size and cost of the domestic debt. And what is that doing? It's crowding out the space for the private sector to take up that credit and invest themselves in productive activity. It's also crowding out the space for public service delivery, education, schools for kids, and the revitalization of the health sector. So while we look at the external side of the debt restructuring, which is proceeding, we also need to be mindful that the budget is posing increasing domestic debt challenges to the sustainability of the economy.
Malawi currently faces climate-related crisis almost every year. Do you think we have started to build up the resilience, or are we still in the response mode? How can we do them together?
I think that's a very good question, and perhaps one of the most important questions the country faces. I mean, today, even as we try to recover from Cyclone Freddy, we're dealing with the impacts of the El Nino phenomenon. And this is the new normal, right? So we are still in response mode, but I think we're learning a lot about what needs to happen. As I mentioned before, the four things that I see as most important would be the shift away from rain-fed subsistence agriculture into commercial farming, which requires a lot of investment in irrigation, water storage. It also requires land reform, the creation of land markets so that people can move and you can start to get aggregate, larger farming, more productive farming. That's going to lead to food security and more sustainable agriculture. Energy resilience, meaning connect Malawi with the surrounding countries. The Zambia interconnector would be excellent for Malawi also to access through Zambia to Tanzania, the East Africa power pool, as well as through Mozambique to the Southern African power pool. That resilience and redundancy in the system is going to be very important for preparing for future shocks. The conservation in the environment and creating sustainable livelihoods instead of cutting the trees, because I think Cyclone Freddy taught us that the mountains are now responding, right? There's no more trees on the mountains. This is a day-to-day reality for most communities here. They know this better than anyone, but it needs to be addressed. And finally, the economic buffers, fiscal buffers, and the national reserves position. These are critical so that when the next crisis does come, Malawi can stand on its own. I think we have seen reductions in the amount of overseas development assistance that donors can provide. I think back in the day, 20 years ago, there would be an overwhelming humanitarian response to these kinds of incidents. Nowadays, you don't see that. Countries have to stand on their own and be self-reliant. And so the economic buffers that we're talking about is just good practice. So those would be the four things. What I'm very proud of and pleased to see in Malawi is a lot of movement now on the resilience side. So we've seen the passage of the DRM bill. We've seen the establishment of the DRM fund. The social protection system is now shock responsive. It has risk insurance built into it. We're going to see that risk insurance triggered this year with a large payout for the droughts in the north. And we've seen a massive expansion horizontally to cover those impacted by Cyclone Freddy and the current food security, now even in urban areas. So the instruments that Malawi has are sophisticated. Malawi's Unified Beneficiary Registry covers 3/4 of the population, which is a lot more than many other African countries. I think 4 years ago it was about 40%. This means you can target rapidly the people who need the help most at the right time. So this is transformational. So shocks are going to come. We need those structural reforms that I mentioned, the 4 ones, for the resilience. But we now start to see the instruments also being operationalized that can help the response side.
Mm-hmm. Now, you have talked more on the structural experiences that Malawi needs to build more. Now, I'm sure part of your projects, they deal with the local communities themselves in the areas. What has been the most challenges in terms of mindset change? Because we have got climate issues on the other hand, and on the other hand, we have got people having difficulties to change their mindset, more especially when it comes to the new and improved methods of farming. Maybe you would want to teach them on how to construct dikes, on how to conserve the water. And we have seen how the droughts affected the people, but then there was kind of a little bit of challenges in order to convince the communities. As World Bank, and with the projects that we have been doing, what do you think should be done in order to continue to change the people's mindsets in order not to face the hunger again and the drought again?
One idea that we've been talking about with the government would be to continue the reform of AIP, the Affordable Input Program, so that it becomes the government's instrument directly to people to promote the kind of mindset change that you're talking about. So what I would suggest is the continued reform of AIP towards a kind of payment for ecosystem services. So this means actually paying communities to take better care, to stop the cutting, to protect the watersheds, to protect the landscapes, to use organic fertilizer in the soil, to put the nutrients back in the soil, and to diversify some of the cropping that they practice. We're already seeing some of this happen, and we in the World Bank are talking intensively with the Ministry of Agriculture on exactly this kind of repurposing of AIP, and I'm extremely pleased at that dialogue and grateful to the government for keeping the door open for that. I think a lot of countries are starting to explore this, but it would be fantastic if Malawi could lead the way.
Now, do you think when we explore that way, do you think that is going to be viable, or people are going to have a positive response to that, or is it going to be a 50-50 win in terms of like we're having here a door on the foot? I mean, a door on the foot, and then on the other hand, people will have the foot on the door. What do you think? Are we not going to lose in terms of people maybe getting the benefits and then not performing in terms of performance? What do you think?
I think people are pragmatic. I think if they see good performance in their neighbor, they will start to practice.
Rewards and practices.
Exactly. I think it's about incentives. But it's also about information, making sure that people have the right information. In a sense, it's about life or death. So I think people will start to make the right decisions. Of course, there's always a need to keep a close eye on the impacts and the outcomes. But I think it can work.
Can work. You're positive that it can work.
Very.
Malawi should take that route.
There's no doubt in my mind that Malawi needs to take that route, and I think it needs to take it urgently. And I think people in the government are thinking seriously about it, and we in the bank want to partner with them to make sure that it works well. We don't want to stand on the sidelines and criticize government policy. We want to work with government to get it right in implementation.
Now, Mr. Riddell, what has been your joyous moment here in Malawi since the years you've been here? What have been your joyous moments?
There's been many. We've had 2 children since I moved to Malawi, and one of the things I do with the older with the girl is read stories every night, and we actually have a story on Malawi that's all about that's on the life of Teresa Kachindemoto, the chief, and I was reading to her this story one night, and she was asking me about this Teresa, She wanted to read the same story night after night. And then the next day I went to participate with His Excellency the President in the launch of the Malawi Education Reform Program, which is constructing over 10,000 school blocks nationally and really trying to expand access for kids. And Chief Kachinamoto was there at the, and so from the night before to the meeting, I couldn't believe I was having the chance to meet with her, and I talked with her, and it was just joyous because of the connection with my daughter, but also so inspiring, the work she's done on girls' education. And it's given me a lot of hope that this agenda in particular, if we can work with Malawians to make sure that girls have more of a chance to participate in the economy, I think that could be potentially the biggest impact on the economy. Can you imagine bringing 1/2 the population into the economic story of this country? It's a game changer, but that starts with education, of course. So that meeting was joyous. There have been many other moments, but it was a joyous meeting, an inspiring meeting, and it shows me that Malawi has huge, huge potential.
Mr. Riddell, thank you so much for taking this time to talk to us on Unpacked.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, as you live in Malawi, where are you going?
I'm going to Central Asia, to the Kyrgyz Republic. I'm going to be the country manager for the World Bank in Bishkek.
That's how we end this week's edition of Unpacked here on MBC. I was talking to Mr. Hugh Riddell, who was the country manager for Malawi in the World Bank. As he goes in his next endeavors here at Unpacked, we wish him all the best, and goodbye for this week.